Hello students, welcome to this lecture on the course on principles of political science. Today's lecture on normative versus empirical methods, a comparative analysis. In the previous lecture, we have studied the two most fundamental or foundational methods of inquiry in political science. In lecture 1, we explored the normative method, and which is a value-based approach that asks what political arrangements ought to be and evaluates them against moral ideas of justice, liberty, equality, and rights. In lecture 12, we studied the empirical method, the fact-based scientific approach that asks what political arrangements actually are and builds knowledge through systematic observation, data collection, and hypothesis testing. Today in lecture 13, we bring these two methods together for a comparative analysis. Comparison is one of the most powerful intellectual tools available to the students of political science. By placing the normative and empirical methods side by side, examining their differences, their similarities, their respective advantages and limitations, we develop a deeper and more complete understanding of each than we would have from studying them separately. The purpose of this comparative lecture is not to declare one method superior to another. Both methods have made indispensable contributions to the political science and political studies. The agenda is briefly revisit each method's definition, examine the basis of comparison, study differences and similarities, access advantages and limitations, and explore why integrating. Before conducting our comparative analysis, let us briefly revisit the normative methods to ensure clarity. The normative method in political science is the approach that places values, ideals, and moral principles at the center of political inquiry. It asks not what political arrangements are, but what they ought to be. It evaluates political systems, law, institutions, and policies by measuring them against standards of justice, fairness, equality, freedom, and the common good. The normative method is philosophically grounded. It builds its conclusions through careful philosophical reasoning, conceptual analysis, and ethical arguments rather than through observation of empirical facts. Its questions are prescriptive. What should a just state look like? What rights should citizens possesses, what obligations do governments have to their people, what forms of political authority are legitimate. The normative tradition stretches from Plato and Aristotle in ancient Greece through the great social contractual thinkers like Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, Kant, to modern political thinkers like John Rawls and Amartya Sen. Each contributed to a rich and ongoing intellectual tradition of thinking carefully and rigorously about what political science or political life ought to be. In brief summary for today's comparisons, the normative method is value-based, philosophically reasoned, descriptive, idealistic in orientation, and concerned with how political life should be organized. Let us now briefly revisit the empirical method to set up our comparison. The empirical method in political science is the approach that focuses on observable facts, systematic evidence, and scientific analysis of political phenomena as they actually exist and function. It asks not what political arrangements should be, but what they actually are. It builds knowledge by observing the real behavior of political actors, collecting data, forming and testing hypotheses, and analyzing findings through rigorous scientific procedures. The empirical method emerged as a major force in political science during the behavioral revolution of the 1950s and 60s, when scholars argued that the discipline needed to adopt scientific standards similar to those of natural sciences. Scholars like David Easton, Harold Laswell, Harold Laswell, Robert Dell, and Gabriel Almond and Sidney Verba exemplified this empirical turn by studying political behavior, power distribution, democratic systems, and political culture through systematic data collection and analysis. In brief summary, for today's comparison, the empirical method is fact-based, scientifically grounded, descriptive, and analytical in character, evidence-oriented, and concerned primarily with understanding how political life actually operates rather than how it should be. It relies on techniques such as survey research, case studies, and statistical analysis to produce verified, replicable findings about political phenomena. David Easton, Harold Laswell, Robert Dell, and Gabriel Almond and Sidney Verba exemplified this empirical turn by studying political behavior, power distribution, democratic systems, and political culture through systematic data collection and analysis. In brief summary for today's comparison, the empirical method is fact-based, scientifically grounded, descriptive, and analytical in character, evidence-oriented, and concerned primarily with understanding how political life actually operates rather than how it should be. It relies on techniques such as survey, research, case studies, and statistical analysis to produce verified, replicable findings about political phenomena. To conduct meaningful comparison between the normative and empirical methods, we need to identify the appropriate dimensions of comparison, the criteria or axes along which the two methods can be meaningfully evaluated and distinguished. There are four primary bases of comparison that structure our analysis in today's lecture. The first basis is values versus fact. The normative method takes values as its primary subject matter and its primary analytical tool. It asks normative questions like questions about justice, rights, duties, and the common good, and answers them through philosophical reasoning about what values require. The empirical method takes facts as its primary subject matter and builds its knowledge from observable, measurable reality. This fundamental difference in what each method studies and how it goes about studying is the most basic dimension of comparison. The second basis is the ideal versus reality distinction. The normative method orients itself towards ideals, towards what political life should be at its best. The empirical method orients itself towards reality, towards political life as it actually is. These different orientations lead to entirely different research agendas, different standards of success, and different contributions to political knowledge. The third basis is their methodological approach, philosophical reasoning versus scientific investigation. The normative and empirical methods differ from each other in several important dimensions. Let us examine their differences systematically. Beginning with the most fundamental difference in their nature. In terms of nature, the normative method is value-laden. It explicitly engages with the questions of values and ethics. It does not attempt to be neutral about political arrangements. Instead, it evaluates them according to moral standards and makes normative judgments about which arrangements are better or worse, just or unjust. The empirical method, by contrast, strives to be value neutral. It studies political phenomena without making moral judgments about them. Its goal is objective, description and explanation to tell us what is and not what ought to be. In terms of approach, the normative method uses philosophical reasoning, conceptual analysis, and ethical arguments as its primary tool. Its approach is reflective and argumentative, building conclusions through careful, reasoned engagements with ideas. The empirical method uses observation, data collection, measurements, and statistical analysis. Its approach is investigative and analytical, building conclusions through systematic examination of evidence. In terms of methodology, the normative method draws on the tradition of political philosophy, reading and engaging with with the canonical texts, developing theoretical arguments, and participating in ongoing philosophical debates. Continuing our comparative analysis, let us now examine the difference between the two methods in their orientation, in their time orientation, their treatment of evidences, and their relationship to political practices. In terms of time orientation, the normative method tends to have a future directed quality. It articulates ideas and visions of how political life could or should be in the future. How can we bring about a betterment of the political life? It looks beyond the present limitations of actual political systems towards what they might become if properly reformed. The empirical methods tend to be present and past directed. It is studied what has happened and what is currently happening in political system, building knowledge from the record of observable political reality. In terms of evidence, the normative method treats philosophical arguments, thought experiments, and conceptual analysis as legitimate and primary forms of evidences. The strength of a normative argument is measured by its logical coherence, its consistency with widely shared moral intuitions, and its success in addressing objections. The empirical method treats observable data, electoral statistics, survey responses, policy outcomes, institutional records as its primary form of evidence. The strength of an empirical argument is measured by the quality and representativeness of its data and the rigor of its analytical procedure. Having examined the many differences between the normative and empirical methods, it is equally important to identify their significant similarities. Recognizing these similarities is essential for understanding why both methods are part of the same discipline and why they are ultimately complementary rather than simply opposed. The most fundamental similarity is that both methods are concerned with the systematic study of political phenomena. Both normative and empirical political scientists are trying to understand political life, to answer important questions about the state, power, organization, institutions, rights, democracy, and the relationship between citizens and political institutions. They approach these questions differently, but they are engaged with the same fundamental subject matter. The second similarity is that both methods make indispensable contributions to the discipline of political science. Without the normative tradition, political science would have no way of evaluating political system. It could describe them in detail, but could not say anything about whether they are just, fair, or desirable. Without the empirical tradition, political science would have no reliable knowledge of how political systems actually work. It could articulate beautiful ideals, but would be unable to say whether those ideals are achievable or how political life might be changed to approach them more closely. A fourth similarity between the normative and empirical methods is that both have evolved significantly over time in response to intellectual challenges, practical demands, and the changing conditions of political life. Neither method is a fixed, unchanging approach. Both have developed, refined themselves, and adopted to new intellectual environments. The normative tradition evolved from ancient Greek concern with the best constitution and the natural order of society through the contractarian tradition of the early modern period, the liberal and socialist traditions of the 19th century, and the contemporary traditions of liberal egalitarianism, communitarian theory, and global justice. Each phase responded to the political challenges and intellectual developments of its time. The empirical tradition evolved from the early descriptive institutionalism of the 19th century, which studied the formal structures of political institutions. Through the behavioral revolution of the mid 20th century and on to the sophisticated quantitative and experimental methods of contemporary empirical political science. Each phase represented a methodological advance in the capacity to study political phenomena rigorously. A fifth similarity is that both methods engage with normative and factual dimensions of politics, though from different primary orientations. The best normative political theorists are informed by empirical knowledge about how political systems actually work and attentive to the practical constraints that determine whether their ideas can be realized in the real world. The normative methods offer several important advantages that explain why it has been central to political science for more than 200 years and why it continues to be indispensable despite the rise of empirical tradition. The first and most important advantage is that the normative method provides ethical guidance for political life. It gives citizens, policymakers, and political institutions a moral framework for evaluating their choices and actions. Without normative analysis, we could have no principled basis for distinguishing just from unjust laws, legitimate from illegitimate political authority, or desirable from undesirable political arrangements. The normative method provides the ethical compass that guides political action and political reform. The second advantage is that the normative method provides an ideal framework, a set of standards and aspirations against which actual political arrangements can be measured and found wanting. Ideals like justice, liberty, equality, and democracy are not merely academic abstractions. They are the standards against which citizens evaluate their governments, demand their rights, and call for political change. These normative ideals have been articulated and refined over centuries, making them available as resources for political criticism. A third advantage, the normative method addresses fundamental questions, authority, the state, and rights. The empirical studies alone cannot answer. The fourth advantage of the normative method is its capacity to inspire and motivate political actions and political reforms. The great normative ideas of political philosophy, the social contract, natural rights, popular sovereignty, human dignity, global justice have not merely been abstract philosophical concepts, they have been the intellectual engines of the most significant political transformations in human history. The American Declaration of Independence in 1776 was built on the normative foundations of natural rights theory. The argument that all men are created equal and endowed with inalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The French Revolution was animated by the normative ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. India's independence movement was inspired by normative commitments to human dignity, self-determination, and the equal worth of all peoples. The Indian Constitution itself is a normative document. Its preamble commits state of India to social, economic, and political justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. These historical examples demonstrate that normative ideas have real world consequences. The political institutions we live under, the rights we enjoy, and the democratic processes through which we govern ourselves are all in important measures the product of normative political thinking. The normative method thus has a direct and powerful connection to political practice that should not be underestimated. The empirical method similarly offers several important advantages. The first and the most important advantage is that it makes political science genuinely scientific. It subjects claims about political phenomena to the discipline of evidence and replaces intuitions, anecdotes, and ideological assertions with verified, reliable knowledge. Before the empirical method became established, many claims about political life were simply assumed or asserted rather than systematically demonstrated. The empirical method raised the intellectual standards of the discipline. The second advantage is that the empirical method enables systematic comparative study of political phenomena across many cases. Empirical researcher can study election, government policies, and democratic institutions across dozens of or hundreds of countries simultaneously, identifying general patterns and testing theoretical claims against a wide body of evidences. The comparative scope gives empirical political science an analytical power that normative philosophy alone cannot match. The third advantage is that the empirical method produces practically useful actionable knowledge for policymakers and governance. Government need to know whether their policies are working, whether a particular educational program improves learning outcomes, whether an anti-corruption law reduces corruption, or whether a health intervention reaches its intended beneficiaries. The fifth advantage of this empirical approach is its capacity to produce verifiable, replicable findings that can be independently checked and built upon by other researchers. This feature makes empirical knowledge genuinely cumulative. Each study adds to a growing body of verified understanding about political phenomena. The cumulative character is what allows political science to make steady progress in understanding how democratic institutions work, what causes political conflict, and what conditions support good governance. The sixth advantage is that the empirical method enables political science to study the actual distribution of political power and the real consequences of political arrangements rather than relying on theoretical assumptions about how political systems should work. Empirical studies have revealed major gaps between the theoretical ideals of democratic governance and its actual practice, showing how economic inequality distorts democratic representation, how institutional design affects policy outcomes, and how social identities shape political behavior. This capacity to reveal the gap between normative ideals and political reality is enormously valuable. In India, the Lok Niti program at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies has provided systematic data-based knowledge about how Indian elections actually work, who participates in politics, and why and how social identities like caste, religion, and gender shape political behavior. The normative method also faces several limitations and criticism. The first and most serious limitation is the problem of subjectivity. Different normative thinkers reasoning carefully from different starting points and value commitments have reached very different and sometimes mutually contradictory conclusions. Plato advocated an aristocratic rule by philosopher king. Rousseau insisted on direct popular sovereignty. Locke championed limited government and individual rights. Marx argued for a classless communist society. Rawls identified or defended liberal egalitarianism. These disagreements suggest that normative reasoning, however careful, cannot achieve the kind of intersubjective agreements that scientific observation can achieve in principle. The second limitation is the lack of scientific proof. Normative claims cannot be empirically tested. The claim that a just society should guarantee equal opportunity to all its citizens is a moral assertion. It cannot be confirmed or disconfirmed by examining political ideas. This means that normative disputes are in principle very difficult to resolve definitively. Two normative thinkers who disagree about the proper basis of distributive justice have no neutral empirical, court of appeal to which they can take their disputes. The third limitation is the risk of ethnocentrism. and cultural bias. The canonical normative traditions develop within a specific Western context, and its central concepts like individual rights, liberty, and democracy have often been criticized for reflecting Western cultural assumptions rather than universal human rights. The fourth limitation of this normative method is the danger of utopianism, becoming so focused on ideal arrangements that the theory loses touch with the political reality and provides no guidance for the reform of actual imperfect political institutions. That is why Plato's Republic is called utopia. If the normative ideal is so far removed from what is actually achievable in the given circumstances that it cannot be approached by any realistic sequence of political reforms, the ideal may inspire but cannot guide. The fifth limitation is that the normative method can be used to justify oppressive political arrangements. History provides many examples of normative arguments used to legitimize slavery, colonialism, the exclusion of women from political life, and the persecution of minorities. When normative reasoning is detached from empirical knowledge about the actual effects of political arrangement on real human beings, it can produce justification for great harm while appearing to maintain philosophical rigor. In the Indian context, the limitation of the normative method are particularly visible in the tension between normative ideals enshrined in the constitution and the empirical realities of Indian political life. The Constitution commits India to equality before the law, the abolition of untouchability, etc., etc. These are powerful normative commitments. The empirical method despite its great strength, also faces limitations. The first is that of value neutrality. The empirical methods tend to exclude moral and evaluative questions altogether from political inquiry, but politics is inherently normative. It is fundamentally about who gets what, who should get what, and what makes political arrangements legitimate or illegitimate. A political science that cannot address these normative dimensions is necessarily incomplete. The second major limitation is over dependence on data. Empirical method studies what can be measured, but many of the most politically important phenomena are extremely difficult to measure. Even if measured, empirically, the value, content, or relativity automatically crops in there. The quality of democratic deliberation in a legislature, the depth of civic commitments among a population, the subtle effects of political culture on governance, these resist quantification. The empirical method's systematic focus on measurable phenomena can lead to the neglect of unmeasured but politically crucial variables. The third limitation is measurement bias. The conclusions of empirical research are only as reliable as the measures used to collect data. If key political concepts like democracy, corruption, or political participation are measured in culturally biased or theoretically inadequate ways, the empirical findings, however sophisticated statistically, will be systematically misleading. Given both the strengths and limitation of each method, now it should be clear that the most productive and adequate approach to the discipline is one that integrates the normative and empirical methods rather than treating them as alternatives between which a researcher must choose. The need for integration arises from the fundamental insights that political life has both a factual dimension, how things actually are, and a normative dimension, how things ought to be, and that neither dimension can be properly understood in isolation from the other. Political science is fundamentally a discipline that aims both to understand and to improve political life. To understand political life, we need the empirical methods, rigorous evidence-based analysis, but to improve political life, we need the normative methods, careful philosophical reasoning about what makes political arrangements just, fair, and desirable. The integration of two approaches is not merely a theoretical ideal, it has been demonstrated in practice by some of the most productive and influential traditions in political science. Amartya Sen's capability approach exemplifies this integration. It combines a normative framework defining development as expanding human capabilities with a rigorous empirical program of measuring capabilities across societies. The integration of the two approach is particularly important in three specific areas of political science: policy making, governance, and political research. In political policy making, the methods are indispensable and must work together. The normative method establishes the goals and values that policy should serve, what we are trying to achieve, and why it matters morally. Should educational policy aim primarily at individual achievement, or should it prioritize reducing inequality or outcomes? This normative question must be answered before the empirical question of how to achieve the chosen objectives can even be posed. Empirical methods then provide the knowledge necessary to design policies and that actually achieve the normatively defined goals. It tells us which intervention work under what condition and with what trade-offs. The combination of normative goal settings and empirical impact evaluation is the basis of evidence-based policy making, one of the most important frameworks for improving the quality of governance in contemporary democracies. In governance, the normative method provides the ethical standards of honesty, fairness, transparency, accountability, and respect for right that constrain and guide the exercise of political power. The empirical method provides knowledge about institutional design, bureaucratic incentives, governmental performance that is necessary for building institutions that actually meet these normative standards. In political research, the integration of the two approaches is equally productive and is exemplified by some of the most important and influential research traditions in the discipline. The study of democracy is particularly clear example. Empirical research study democracy by measuring democratic institutions and practices across countries and over time using indicators like electoral competitiveness, civil liberties, government accountability, and rule of law. But the choice of which indicator to measure reflects normative commitments about what democracy fundamentally is and requires. Different normative concepts of democracy, procedural, substantive, deliberative, participatory, lead to different empirical indicators and different conclusions about which countries are or area not democratic. Human rights research similarly combines normative and empirical elements. The normative tradition defines what human rights are and why they matter, grounding them in inherent dignity and equal worth of all persons. Empirical research then studies where and why human rights are violated, what institutional factors protect or undermine rights, and how effective different mechanisms of rights protection are. The comparative analysis of normative and empirical method is not merely an academic exercise. It has powerful contemporary relevance in several areas of political analysis and governance that are of immediate practical importance. The first area is the growing emphasis on data-driven governance, the use of large-scale data analytic, performance metrics, and evidence-based evaluation to guide public policy and governmental decisions. The second area is the increasing sophistication of political analysis in contemporary democracies, enabled by the growing availability of large-scale political data, big data, social media analytics, and machine learning algorithms now allow political analysts to study public opinion, behavior, and mobilization at an unprecedented scale and near real time. This empirical capacity is transforming political analysis, but using it well requires a normative framework to guide the questions asked, the data collected and interpretations made. We are just concluding our lectures. Today's comparison has added a new dimension, showing how the two methods relate to each other and how each is eliminated by contrast with other. We established four bases of comparison: values versus fact, the ideals versus reality, philosophical reasoning versus scientific investigation, and prescription versus description. Against these bases, we identified major differences of nature, approach, methodology, objective, time orientation, treatment of evidence, and relationship to political practice. We then identified the similarities: both study political phenomena systematically, both contribute indispensably to political science, both require intellectual rigor, and both have evolved substantially over time. We assess the advantages and limitation of each method. The normative method provides ethical guidance, ideal framework, and political inspiration, but faces limitations of subjectivity, lack of scientific proof, and risk of utopianism. Thank you.